Welcome to the Venture Clash Entrepreneurship Podcast, where we meet entrepreneurs in the digital health and fintech spaces. Together, we'll hear real-world stories, gain practical insights, and discover the amazing things happening behind the scenes of thriving early-stage companies making their mark. It's time for the Venture Clash Entrepreneurship Podcast.
Well, hey there, I'm Kenny Jang, and this is another episode of the Venture Clash Entrepreneurship Podcast. Welcome to today's show. It's going to be a fantastic conversation today as usual. We are lucky to have Dana Bouchin, who's an immigration attorney and partner at Updike, Kelly & Spellis CPC. It's a major Connecticut law firm. UKS has offices in Hartford, New Haven, East Haven, Middletown, Stores. They're all over Connecticut, and they actually have affiliation with Meritas law firms in all 52 states and 80 countries around the world. Welcome to the show today, Dana.
Thank you, Kenny. It's great being on this show.
So today is a little bit different a conversation than we've been usually having. We've been talking to the leaders and the CEOs and founders of startup ventures, specifically digital health, fintech, and insurtech. And today we're turning the tables a little bit, talking to you as an attorney who helps partner with those types of companies. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and the actual specific area of law that you practice, Dana?
Sure, Kenny. So my name is Dana Bouchin, and I am an immigration attorney with UKS. As part of my immigration practice, I work with a lot of companies in the high-tech sector who may need to hire foreign labor because of shortages in the STEM fields here in Connecticut and in the U.S. in general. I also work with foreign entrepreneurs and foreign investors who might be interested in opening their own businesses and gain a visa status or a green card status based on such investments or entrepreneurship. I work with the venture community here with companies who may be interested in attracting foreign financing into their companies by using immigration incentives. Wow. I work as an immigration partner in a general practice law firm that, as you said, has offices in all 52 states and 80 countries around the world.
Wow. So I love the fact that you have that, the breadth and also the depth of experience with that startup community. You mentioned visas for entrepreneurs and investors. Could you spend a little time telling us a little bit about those, and what's the first step people really need to take to explore that area?
Sure, Kenny. In fact, I'm very glad to address this topic because it's a lesser known avenue to a visa green card. Not many people talk about these visas available for entrepreneurs and investors. Yeah. And the reason is that a lot of these visas have been in existence for quite some time, but just recently they've been repurposed to serve more the entrepreneurs and the investors. So I'm going to go over 4 major types of visas available to entrepreneurs and investors.
Oh, that's great.
I'm going to start with the category that has been widely known because the media paid a lot of attention to it. It's the EB-5 program. Okay. And that's probably the only one that most people heard of. It's the program whereby a foreign investor is willing to invest at least $1 million, or if in a targeted employment area, at least $500,000, and as long as they generate 10 full-time American jobs within the 2 years after the investment, then they would get an EB-5 green card. Now, that's one of the avenues for investors. One of the reasons why many times I recommend the other avenues is because this program, as great as it is, takes a long time for the government to adjudicate or decide. It takes an average of 14 months for the government to finally make a decision on the case. Now, for those investors and entrepreneurs who are looking for a faster turnaround, I recommend the E2 or the L1 visas.
Yeah, I've heard the L1 before. Yes. Tell us about those.
So let's start with the let's start with the L1. L1 is a visa for intra-company transferees. In other words, multinational managers, executives, or folks with specialized knowledge. Yeah. And I'm going to specifically pick the category that's for multinational managers or executives, called the L1A visa. This involves having a company abroad in any country around the world, and having been a manager or executive at that company for at least one full-time year within the past 3 years would entitle you to then transfer as a manager or executive to the U.S. subsidiary of that foreign company. So that's the L1A visa, and it takes only 15 days for the government to decide an L1A visa case with premium processing. And so it is relatively fast to get one if you are eligible. Now, this L1A visa are not only for multinational companies, they're also for startups.
Yep.
Who can prove their business potential, especially if the startup part of the company is in the U.S. So say let's pick China. Say the Chinese company is somewhat mature, and they're thinking about establishing a brand new subsidiary in Connecticut.
Yes.
In that scenario, even though the U.S. subsidiary would be a startup, nevertheless, there's the possibility of an L1A visa for the top management, based solely on the presentation of a business plan to immigration, which business plan should be credible in convincing immigration that there's potential for job creation. So that's the L1A visa. A similar visa is the E2 visa.
Yep.
E2 visa is based on a treaty, a bilateral investment treaty between the U.S. and the country of nationality of the investor. Now, 80 countries around the world have an E2 treaty. Unfortunately, China, India, Russia, and Brazil, the BRIC countries, do not have an E2 treaty, but a lot of other countries do. So most of Europe has an E2 treaty. Majority of Latin American countries have it. Quite a few African and Asian countries have it. Now, the E2 treaty visa is very similar in concept to the L1A, except that it presents the additional benefit of allowing an individual to do the investment. It doesn't have to be done through a company abroad that would establish a U.S. subsidiary. It could be simply an Indian national who would come from India to Connecticut and individually open a startup company here.
Is there a minimum investment level for that?
No, there is not a minimum investment level like the EB5. EB5 has a minimum investment under the law. However, the E2 and the L1 do not have any minimums written into the law. For E2, there's a legal requirement that the individual or the company invest a substantial amount of capital in that business, and that they own and control that company. Now, a substantial amount of capital has been interpreted to mean just roughly enough capital that you could show you could run that company with. So enough capital to cover your startup expenses, plus run that business for 6 months to a year. So I could tell you from experience, it depends on the costs of the business, on the how much capital does it need to run this business. But I have been getting approved for E2 visas for as little as $40,000 for high-tech businesses with low overhead. So it could be anywhere $40,000 to over $100,000 to upwards of $200,000. It really depends on how much you want to invest. There's no maximum, so you can invest as much as you want.
So it really is a flexible option there.
Yes, it's a flexible option. Now, there are some requirements, of course, attached, such that, for example, the person would have to show that the funds that are being obtained towards the investment in an E2 enterprise are clean from legitimate sources. Sure. and that they're your personal funds. In case you are an individual investing individually, then they are your personal funds and not loans from other people. They could be gifts from other people, but not loans.
Okay.
So this covers the E2 and the L1, and then there's the H-1B visa that a lot of people have heard about. The H-1B visa is traditionally the most common visa used by professional workers. It's the visa of choice for most of the foreign workforce working currently for American employers. Now, the problem with it is that it's limited to 85,000 visas per year,
Yes.
and each year we more than
Yep,
exceed.
we max out, right?
We max
hear about
out.
that every year.
Correct. And so that is a possibility even for startups. Not many people think about this, but H-1B visas could successfully be used by startups. There are some requirements, for example, that even if you are the owner and controller of your business, usually you would not be eligible for an H-1B visa if you're the owner and controller of your business. However, there are some exceptions available for those startup founders who manage to set up an independent board of directors with decision making over hiring decisions. And so that is a possibility for an H-1B visa. The other problem with the H-1B visa, because it's capped at 85,000 a year, is even if you set up that independent board and you do everything right, you might still not win the lottery. So the way around it is, for many, has been to run your business to be affiliated with a university, because universities get an unlimited number of H-1Bs.
Right.
So in short, there are alternatives for entrepreneurs and investors. It's just that there needs to be a lot of creativity as to how to use these visas.
Interesting. So from your perspective, I guess, talking about the actual startup and venture community, do you feel on your side that they should have a greater interest in this topic? That, it seems like these visas are obviously beneficial for the foreign nationals that want to come and work in our country here in the U.S. But I think what you're saying is that there probably is a lot more benefit to corporations, to startups and ventures, and this whole community if they learn more about resources such as these.
Absolutely. There are two major ways in which I could see a benefit to the general venture community. First benefit is tapping into foreign labor in the STEM fields that's not otherwise available here, because unfortunately we do not graduate enough STEM students to respond to the needs of our economy. So most corporate America, who is in need of STEM labor force, sees itself compelled to tap into the labor force.
Right.
When you do that, you absolutely need to pay attention to immigration laws, because you cannot just have someone show up and work for you without proper work authorization. So you have to make sure that that person who's going to work for you has proper work authorization. The second way in which the venture community has an interest in this topic is access to foreign financing. It's another source of financing that is not so talked about, but is out there because of the immigration incentives for someone to actually invest in this country. As I mentioned, for example, there's the E2 visa and the L1 visa that provides incentives for for a company or an individual to invest in the U.S. Now, nobody says they have to invest in their own business.
Right.
The EB-5 program, in fact, encourages them via the EB-5 Direct, encourages foreign nationals to invest in an existing U.S. enterprise and take an equity stake, even if a minority equity stake in that enterprise. So this is one way of attracting financing. The other way is joint ventures. Both the L1 visa and the E2 visa work very well if the foreigner owns and controls 50% and the U.S. party owns and controls the other 50% of a joint venture in whatever field of common endeavor. There is no limit on the types of industries, and especially the high-tech sector is wide open for joint venturing. Now, of course, there are some fields that are out of the question, such as military and some aerospace. However, generally speaking, there is no limit on the industry per se.
So that's really interesting. So what can actually be done to attract more investments for the entrepreneurship community locally here from these foreign nationals? How do we promote that, or what's one or two things you see that can be done on our side?
Promotion is number one. One of the problems out there is lack of awareness about visa alternatives.
Education, basically.
Awareness raising for foreigners to understand that there are immigration incentives for them to actually invest here and create jobs. I find that that's actually a novelty every time I raise it with prospective clients.
For sure.
The other thing that we could do to attract more is to make their landing here soft as possible. So once they're here, because they're in a new environment and they don't know exactly how this new environment works, there needs to be an ecosystem that's already set up to assist foreign companies who want to land here. Things like advisors, consultants around, but also care for their visa situation or visa, especially if that tends to be the motivation, the main motivation behind their move to invest. So you have to pay very close attention to what motivates them, and in a lot of these cases they are motivated by the American dream of coming here, ensuring a solid immigration status such as a green card, and then, of course, working on their business.
Well, so what would you advise? Like, what if a foreign national, if they had an interest in investing here in the States or coming in as an entrepreneur, from their perspective, what do you think the next step for them to do? Because they need to make the connections to be sponsored for these types of visas, right?
Correct. So once it's been decided that once they respond to a campaign to raise awareness about these visa options and they positively identify immigration to be their main motivation, then they clearly must get in touch with an immigration attorney who can advise them as to how to structure their investment from the very beginning so as to get that visa or that green card that they're really looking for. And so I would say the next step is those who are motivated by immigration should be put in touch with an immigration attorney. Obviously, there may be cases that are motivated solely by business or investment, in which case I'm sure that we can put them in touch with the proper resources. Or who knows, there may be others who may be motivated mainly by tax reasons, and I'm sure there are tax experts, etc. So the motivation has to be understood, and the person has to be assisted accordingly.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So, so a law firm like yours, which, I mean, it's a large enterprise, right? You've got a large network, multiple offices, big JV with another affiliation. What size startup teams do you actually guys service? Is it the back of napkin, I've got an idea in a garage, or a restaurant, or is it startups with prototypes and actually they're getting to the market? At what point should they start to engage with you? Because I think startup teams are constantly thinking about how do they expand their team? How do they bring more talent into their team? At what point do they engage with a company like yours?
Sure. I'm happy to report that although it sounds very impressive in terms of how many affiliations we have, the very reason we are affiliated as independent firms under a common logo such as Meritas is because we are not big law firms. We are small, medium-sized law firms in our markets who can achieve better pricing and better connections and better access to legal expertise by affiliating with like-minded, like-situated firms in other jurisdictions. So, for example, our, say, London equivalent is our mirror image here in Connecticut, and we have about 68 lawyers in all our offices in Connecticut, which is actually considered a medium-sized law firm, not a big law firm by any stretch of the imagination. Therefore, we serve all levels of a startup from the very beginning until post-revenue and beyond. We do not have restrictions as to when they should come in and talk to us, especially if they are motivated by immigration. The sooner, the better, because a good thing starts with planning from the beginning.
Gotcha.
A visa situation gets set up gradually.
Yeah, I've heard time and time again from successful entrepreneurs that they wish that they brought in counsel much earlier than they did. And there is just this sense of intimidation, or you're established and they're not, and so it's that bridge that needs to happen so that they reach out for help and counsel, right?
Right. Well, to get over that intimidation, I would invite them to come to either our Stores office or Middletown office, which are small and very comfy looking. Nothing intimidating. Nothing intimidating about those.
Well, I just love the fact that, even today you are so accessible when we invited you onto the podcast. And that's, I think, some of the nature of the game is that, you're here to really support, help support, nourish, and help startups flourish. And that's your function in the ecosystem. And that we just want to encourage the startup, the people in the startup community to really think about establishing informal and formal relationships with attorneys and firms like yours, right? That's in their best interest.
That's correct. I would encourage the same thing, Kenny, and I do appreciate the opportunity to be on this podcast. And I would like to take the opportunity to wish all your startups the best of luck in establishing themselves. And we are here and available to serve their needs. And we can be contacted. The simplest way to be contacted is to do a simple Google search for my name, Dana Bouchin. Or otherwise, that's where you will find out my email address, which is dbouchin@uks.com, or my telephone number, etc. It's all on the internet these days.
Great.
LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, everywhere.
And as we close out this time together, we usually ask for one practical tip that we can leave our listeners here. So I'm going to ask you one of our lightning round questions is, what book, conference, or industry association, what resource do you choose to spend your time, your precious time with, especially in the context of startup ventures? What can you recommend to our audience today?
That's going to be very tricky in the context of investor or business visas in general, because I found that there's a gap in knowledge. There are wonderful resources for startups in the business side of the startups, and there are wonderful resources on the immigration side of those startups, but nothing that combines those together. Not a good publication that combines the two together. The closest that it comes, if anyone wants to check more on these types of visas, would be to go to uscis.gov, which is the governmental website listing all the types of visas. And that would still leave you wondering, okay, so how does that apply in my case? Right. And unfortunately, it's a knowledge gap. It's the reason we don't hear as much about these visas, because it's emerging as we speak. How exactly do we fit old visa categories to the new world of high-tech innovation? It's a world in the making, and I myself have to mold these visa types every single day to better and better fit entrepreneurs today. So uscis.gov, just Googling E2 visas and L1 visas and EB5, although that will lead you to different sites. Pick the .gov sites as much as possible.
That's a good tip. Good tip. Well, Dana, thank you so much for spending time with us and being generous with your wisdom and sharing a little bit about this. Education is the name of the game in this area. And Dana Bouchin, you're with UKS. They can find out more about your firm specifically at www.uks.com, correct?
Correct.
And then what's the best way for them to directly get in touch with you specifically? Is it that email address that you gave?
Yes, it's my email address, dbouchin@uks.com, or they could feel free to call me, 860-548-2629. That's a direct extension. Or simply Googling my name, and that will also give them the benefit of finding out more about my background, qualifications, client reviews, etc.
I love it. It's so refreshing to meet people like you that really want to help and support the community and just is being so accessible. So thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, everybody, for listening in on our conversation here at the Venture Clash Entrepreneurship Podcast. You can get the transcript, the show notes, the links all on our website at ventureclash.com. And that's also the place you'll find out information about our $5 million venture competition that's going on right now. If you are a startup venture in the digital health, fintech, or insurtech categories, you'll want to check out our Venture Clash competition at www.ventureclash.com. See you next time. Thanks, Dana, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of the Venture Clash Entrepreneurship Podcast. Drop by www.ventureclash.com as to learn about the $5 million Venture Clash Startup Challenge. We've set aside millions to support your innovation and product offerings. Venture Clash is also the place where you'll find the resources you need to help grow your business. Check out the contest at www.ventureclash.com today.